monitoring of human rights violations. It is often linked with the production and dissemination of reports on human rights abuses, and it is often linked with advocacy campaigns that human rights and humanitarian activists initiate in behalf of a certain group of victims or on a general human rights issue. So, in other words, generally, witnessing is associated with the use of certified information as leverage to produce certain political results. And this is another way to say that witnessing functions as a kind of a politics of truth. Politics of truth in the sense that it is basically about turning the power of facts against what is perceived as suffering that can be alleviated or that can be prevented by a concerted social action. So I would like to add to this understanding of witnessing, or to this initial definition of witnessing as a politics of truth, another definition that you probably had a chance of encountering while reading Peter Redfield's piece on Médecins Sans Frontières. And as you probably remember, Redfield refers to witnessing as a practice that has to do with the production and dissemination of what he calls motivated truth. And Redfield defines motivated truth as truth that is proclaimed in open association with a point of view. Now, the point of view that Redfield alludes to doesn't necessarily amount to the expression of an explicit opinion. This point of view that he refers to is often embodied in the moral conviction that drives acts of witnessing in the first place. And this is the conviction that certain forms of suffering that can be alleviated or prevented should be alleviated or prevented. And that the production and dissemination of information is highly instrumental in this regard. Now, what I want to do now is to dwell for a minute on the assumption that undergirds the practice of witnessing in its sense as motivated truth. Now, witnessing in its sense as the production and dissemination of empirical knowledge on human rights violations and political disasters only makes sense if this knowledge is ascribed with some kind of a magical ability to change the current state of affairs. And many human rights and humanitarian activists believe that knowledge and information indeed have this quality. They tend to assume that more information on distant suffering or human rights violations will yield greater awareness, and that this awareness will inevitably lead to the right kind of action. Information creates awareness, which leads to the right kind of action. That's the basic formula that, in a way, operates or that characterizes the mindset of many human rights and humanitarian activists. Now, I would like to illustrate this point by considering the example of the human rights organization Witness. You consider logo. And Witness is an organization that was founded in 1992 by the musician Peter Gabriel. And its activity consists of helping local activists around the world using video cameras and video footage in order to document human rights violations. The slogan of Witness, as you can see, is see it, film it, change it. See it, film it, change it. This is a logo that betrays a promise, but also a certain assumption. And this assumption holds that certified information, which means in this case, filmed evidence, irrefutable evidences for human rights violations, have a politically transformative function in and of themselves. So I think that we can consider the slogan of Witness as a graphic illustration of the kind of mindset that is shared by many humanitarian and human rights activists today. And yet, it needs to be said that the belief of activists in the power of words and images to protect victims of human rights violations is not as strong as it used to be. Because during the 1990s, activists were confronted with a series of political disasters that eroded this conviction in the power of truth. And I'm referring in particular to the civil war and then international intervention in Somalia, to the war in the former Yugoslavia, and, of course, to the genocide in Rwanda and its aftermath. Now, those episodes were unsettling for human rights and humanitarian activists for many reasons. But one of the prominent reasons was that during those political disasters, acts of witnessing failed to produce effective political results. Even worse, during those political disasters, acts of witnessing were eventually turned against the same victims whom they were supposed to protect. So I would like now to demonstrate what I think can be referred to as the disillusionment with witnessing by referring to the case of the war in Bosnia. The war in Bosnia broke out in 1992 after the disintegration of the Yugoslav Federation and ended in 1995. And during the war, Serb militias carried out a campaign of ethnic cleansing against civilians from Bosnian origin. Now, in 1993, in an attempt to protect the Bosnian civilians that were under Serbian attacks, the UN declared 6 Bosnian enclaves as safe havens. Safe havens, that is, as areas in which Bosnian civilians were supposed to be protected. By whom? By the peacekeeping forces that were sent to those enclaves to, at least theoretically, protect the Bosnians. Now, in the film A Cry from the Grave that I asked you to watch, we see what happens when Serb forces take over one such enclave, the city of Srebrenica. And what happens is the worst massacre that has taken place in Europe since World War II, with 8,000 men assassinated by Serb forces after they were separated from their wives and children. And what is even more outrageous than this massacre itself is the fact that it took place in spite of the fact that there were UN peacekeeping forces in Srebrenica. There were peacekeeping forces in Srebrenica, but their mandate was very limited, and they didn't act firmly enough to prevent this massacre from occurring. So, as you could see in that documentary, and as you could read in Tom Keenan's piece, in those Bosnian enclaves that I just described, there were aid workers, peacekeeping forces, journalists, TV cameras stationed more or less everywhere. So the world, so to speak, knew about the violence in Bosnia. The world knew what was taking place. Both Western governments and ordinary citizens received regular reports on the war. And yet, Western governments chose to respond to the atrocities that were committed in Bosnia by dispatching humanitarian assistance and peacekeeping forces. In other words, those reports were not enough, were not sufficient in and of themselves. They failed to produce the kind of political will that was necessary in order to make Western governments undertake a military intervention that could have provided effective protection to civilians. So as a result, during the war in Bosnia, and of course after the war ended, there was a widespread feeling that the world failed to react to the violence, and that the Bosnians were practically abandoned by the international community. But what is even more crucial for our discussion is that following that war, it was felt that this failure to adequately protect the Bosnians was a sign for a deeper problem in the very mechanism of bearing witness to atrocities. And many claimed that the reports on the war in Bosnia and that the images from the war in Bosnia failed to trigger an effective international intervention because reports on and images of atrocities don't quite work the way we expect them to work. And the war in Bosnia and the other political disasters that took place during the 90s that I alluded to earlier were the backdrop against which there emerged a new interest in the notion of compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue was a way to explain why information on human rights violations was often met with indifference.
Was that incident one where the Dutch contingent was not?
Exactly, yeah. That's the story. The story of Srebrenica is the story of the Dutch, mainly Dutch force